And this is the frontal setup as a result of the low, with the cooler air coming in this continuation of swirl here. And the area of action of this low is tremendous. It includes a good part of all of
All right, great to see you this morning. Really good to have you worshiping here today. And as was already mentioned, welcome to those in the video venue as well as online. We have a number of people that still worship with us online because, the price of gas. So they're deciding to, stay home rather than spend the fortune to get here. So thank you for joining us, however you're here. And for those who made a big commitment to drive here this morning, I'm grateful to see you as well. The Bible says, I will lift up the cup of salvation and call upon the name of the Lord. I've noticed that over the years I have this phrase that I tend to say over and over again to people. Someone might be sharing with me a struggle that they're having in their life, a particular challenge that they're facing, and we'll talk about it a little bit, and then I find myself often saying this. I'll say, I'll bet there will be a time in the future when we will sit down together and we will look back and marvel at the faithfulness of God. There's a famous Irish blessing. It ends with this phrase, may the sun shine warm upon your face, may the rain fall soft upon your fields, and until we meet again, may God hold you in the hollow of his hand. I just put it this way. I say, I'll bet there'll be a time in the future when we will sit down together and we will look back at this and we will marvel at the faithfulness of God. Now, of course, when I say that, it's just a hunch. When I say that, it's just a hope. It's just a prayer. Sure, it is based in the track record of God in my own life, His faithfulness time and time again. Still, when I say that to someone, there's no guarantee that we will actually, in the future, sit down together and marvel at what God has done. When I say it, it's just a genuine and heartfelt wish. But did you know that Jesus said pretty much the very same thing to his disciples? That he promised them that in the future he would sit down with them, with us, and celebrate all that he has done. Open with me, if you will, to Matthew 26. As we look at this time when Jesus said to his disciples that there will be a time in the future when he will sit down with them and celebrate all that he has done. And here's the difference. When Jesus says it, it's not just a hunch. It's not just a hope so, that would be nice. When Jesus speaks about this time in the future when he will raise a cup and we will look back at all that he has done, it's 100% forecast, a bankable promise, an ironclad guarantee. Absolutely certain. Today, as we look at Matthew 26, I want to look at Jesus' promise to finish what he started in your life. Matthew 26, starting in verse 26. As we turn there in the Bible, today we continue our series, 100% chance of. We have been looking at these I will promises of Jesus in the book of Matthew. But this morning, before we get there, I want to look at a famous I will promise by God in the Old Testament, which will help us explain a very mysterious I will not promise by Jesus in the New Testament. I don't know if you ever saw this. One day, Jesus made a surprising promise. He said, I will not. Which catches me off guard because, at least in this series, we've been thinking about all Jesus' promises that come with the words, I will. But what makes this I will not promise so profound is it is based and grounded in a very famous I will promise that every Jewish person in Jesus' day would have known. By now you've found Matthew 26:26, and let's begin by talking about two promises you should never forget. The setting here of this part of the Scripture is the famous Last Supper. Jesus has gathered his disciples there, and we read these words in verse 26. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take, eat, this is my body." The 12 disciples were there around the table, not prepared for those words when Jesus said it. Now don't forget, they didn't call this meal the Last Supper. For them, it was the Passover. So preparations had been made for all the Passover festivities. Everywhere you look, people were getting ready in their homes and in the parts of the town. They were getting ready to observe the Passover. They would share together this traditional meal that had been part of their heritage for centuries, like they had done since they were children. Not just bread and juice, but also lamb and herbs. It was the biggest of all the Jewish festivals. It was the Passover. And for the disciples, ever since they were kids, they had been taught that this meal was infused with all kinds of symbolism. It was meant to convey something, to portray something, to commemorate something, and to memorialize something, especially the cups. Verse 27. Then Jesus that is, he took a cup. And when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you." Scholars aren't quite sure which cup that Jesus took, because during the Passover meal, then as well as now, there would have been 4 cups. We might put it this way, there would have been 4 toasts during the meal. 4 times they would lift a cup. And here's where it gets super interesting. These 4 cups that they would lift at Passover would perfectly capture the promise of Passover. Here's what I mean. Each of the 4 cups that would be lifted during the Passover meal would remember the promise, the commitment, the passion of God for his people that is conveyed in Exodus 6 and 7. There we read these words, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm, and with mighty acts of judgment, I will take you as my own and be your God. 4 I will promises commemorated at the Passover with 4 cups. Each cup represented each one of these promises. And wouldn't you agree, what a perfect connection here for our series, because in this series we've been focused on all these I will promises. Well, Passover itself was grounded in God's commitment to his people with the words I will. So there are 4 cups at Passover. The first cup was linked to the first I will. I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. It was called the cup of deliverance, remembering how God had delivered the people from Egypt. The head of the family would pronounce a blessing over that first cup, and the cup then would be shared, followed by herbs dipped in a sauce. This first part then of the Passover promise was the idea that I will rescue you. I will rescue you, God said to his people. The second cup was linked to the second I will free you from being slaves to them. It was called the cup of freedom. At this point, the youngest son asked the question, why is this night different from all other nights? And the host tells the story of how God set free the people, their own people, the Israelites, from the land of Egypt. So this next part of the Passover promise was this, I will liberate you. That was part of the promise of God to his people. The third cup then would come sometime along in the meal. It was linked to the third I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and will with mighty acts of judgment. It was called the cup of redemption appropriately. This was accompanied with singing. So added to the Passover promise is now this: I will rescue, I will liberate, and I will redeem you. And all of this was followed in the meal with a fourth cup linked to the final part of this verse: I will take you as my own people and be your God. Appropriately called the cup of consummation. It was the goal of God's rescue of his people that they would see him as their God and that they would understand themselves as his people. And that completes the Passover promise: is I will rescue, liberate, redeem, and adopt you as my own. And all of that is captured in what they would celebrate at Passover, that God had made a commitment to his people, that he would rescue them, that he would liberate them, that he would redeem them, and that he would adopt them and be their God, and they would be his people, captured in the Passover promise. And as the disciples gathered there that evening, that's what was in their minds. That was since they were kids, that was in their minds. This is what Passover was all about, this incredible promise of God. And there's every reason to believe that Jesus and his disciples observed a full Passover meal, all the elements, which means Jesus lifted several cups. We know for sure that there was more than one because Luke records in his account of this, the Last Supper, he mentions a couple different cups. So there's every reason to believe that Jesus and his disciples took all four cups during that Passover meal, celebrating each part of God's promise to his people. Which begs the question, which one was this cup that we read here in Matthew? Well, there's no way to say definitively which one it is. Some Bible scholars make a case for the first or the third, the cup of rescue or the cup of redemption, which connects nicely with Jesus' death on the cross the following day. But no matter what, we know this. Jesus knew the Passover promise. The disciples knew the Passover promise. But there that evening, as he gathered his disciples there for the very last time, he infused it with even deeper symbolism. Verse 28, holding the cup, he said these words: "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." In other words, Jesus' death was God's ultimate plan to rescue, liberate, redeem, and adopt you. All that the Passover had anticipated was now coming to fruition as Jesus prepared to die for the sins of the world and of us. It was all coming to fruition. So never forget this Passover promise. Never forget this, that all that Jesus fulfilled and all the people anticipated for Passover, infused with deeper meaning now because of the cross. God will rescue, liberate, redeem, and adopt you. It's 100% guaranteed. And it was sealed at the cross. But then Jesus gives us a new promise. And I will not promise. It is the promise of communion. Verse 29. I tell you, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. It's kind of a surprising promise. I mean, I don't usually think of promises beginning with the phrase, I will not. But truth is, it can be a very powerful promise. Think about it. After the devastation of the flood in Noah's day, God set a rainbow in the sky, and then he infused it with this promise, basically saying, I will not destroy the earth by flood ever again. A mother promises her child, don't worry, I will not forget to pick you up. A son promises his father, I will not let you down. A dad looks at his daughter and says, I will not miss the soccer match. A groom promises his bride, I will not value anyone above you. Or how about this? God promises us, his children, I will never leave you or forsake you. Sometimes an I will not promise can be powerful. Again, verse 29. I tell you, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until the day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. But what is Jesus saying there? Actually, what is the promise that's embedded in this "I will not" phrase? I want to unpack it for you, but basically he is saying this. He is saying, I will not leave my work in you unfinished. Don't worry. I will not leave my work in you unfinished. Someday in the future, he says, we will sit down together and celebrate all that I have done. Someday in the future, I will lift this cup again. Someday in the future, you will see all that I have done to rescue, liberate, redeem, and adopt you. Someday in the future, we will feast together. And until then, I will wait. I will wait for you to join me at that table, at that banquet in heaven. But you can count on this. It's going to happen. Because I will not leave my work in you unfinished. You see where I'm going, right? Jesus anticipates a day in heaven, the great banquet that's going to be held there, when he will lift a cup again once more. He will announce a toast. And everything that generations have ever hoped for at Passover, everything that was ultimately secured at the cross will now be consummated in heaven. Because Jesus will not leave his work in you unfinished. The Bible says this, being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. Jesus will not leave his work in you unfinished. It is a great "I will not" promise. He looks forward to that day when he will celebrate with you, with me, with us, with his family, and say, remember I told you this was going to happen. And we would be here and we would look back and marvel at all that I've done. So let's do this. Let's take a deeper dive into this promise, this "I will not" phrase. Again, verse 29. I tell you, I will not drink from this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. What does a deeper look at this verse tell us? I think there's about 5 things that come to mind. First of all, this communion promise tells us that Jesus will be patient with our progress. He will be patient with our progress. I notice when I look closely that Jesus says, from now on until that day. It reveals that he anticipates a gap between his work on the cross and our celebrating in heaven. That there would be a time that he would abstain from celebrating all that the Passover meal and communion anticipated. And in the meantime, Jesus is patient with our progress. You may not feel fully liberated from the temptations you battle or the struggles you face. You may not feel fully redeemed and liberated, fully adopted, like you're always seeing yourself as a part of God's family, fully rescued from the things you struggle with. Jesus knew there would be a gap, and he is patient with our progress. What else? Well, the promise goes on to say, I will not drink from the fruit of the vine from now on until the day when I drink it new. I'm struck by that word new. Jesus looks forward to that time in heaven when he will make all things new, including you. So the communion promise also tells us that Jesus will save us completely. He will make us brand new. Yes, Jesus saves us when we come to him and first trust him at the very beginning of a relationship with him. We are saved at that point, but that's just the beginning. He continues to save us, and he continues to rescue us. He continues to redeem us, and he is working in our lives so that we would be fully saved. And so the process of salvation only is initiated when we come to him in faith. And then he spends the rest of our life continuing to save us and make us fully restored. He restores us back to our factory settings, to the God's design for us from the very beginning, what he intended in the Garden of Eden and what he intended when you and I were born, the purpose for our lives. He begins that process of restoring us and continuing to redeem us fully. And that work in us of saving us fully, completely, is his work, not ours. It's a work that he does in us, just like salvation. Salvation is something that we trust him for, and full redemption is something that we also trust him for. And so I love that this is a part of the communion promise too, because communion reminds us that it is not our own efforts. It is what God has done for us. Christian author Shauna Nyquist, talking about the communion table, put it this way. She said this: the table is the place where the doing stops, the trying stops, and we allow ourselves to be nourished like children. We allow someone else to meet our need. We come not preparing the table, not having done all the work to put the meal together. We come simply to communion, and we take as someone else has prepared it for us. Since the promise of communion is that Jesus will finish his work in us, we have this 100% forecast. Jesus will save us completely. And he anticipates a day in heaven, where he will lift a cup and he will celebrate that good news. Next, when I look at this promise by Jesus as I will not promise, I love how physical this promise is. Heaven apparently has food and drink. In other words, the communion promise tells us that Jesus will satisfy us fully. It's such a different picture than the ghost-like image of heaven that we have, that we're just kind of floating around with see-through bodies. This image is so physical, it's so tangible, it's eating and drinking, pleasurable and celebratory, this feast in heaven. I love how tangible heaven is, because so many of us have this idea that heaven is sort of this, like I said, kind of the see-through experience where we're sort of just half people, and like the real life is here on earth. And C.S. Lewis, in his writing about heaven, says, heaven will be more tangible, more real than this life. The world itself will be more grabbable, more real, more touchable, more experienceable. And so we got this picture of heaven with feasting of food and drink. I'm a sucker for watching It's a Wonderful Life every Christmas. And you remember that scene, if you've seen it, where the angel Clarence comes to earth and he can't wait to have a drink on earth because he's not allowed to in heaven? You remember that? He hesitates, and then he finally orders a mulled wine, heavy on cinnamon and light on the cloves, as if it would have been banned in heaven. So, you got to take advantage of it while he's here on earth. Maybe we should think more positively about heaven, since Jesus promised a wedding supper of the Lamb there when we would get there, and he would celebrate us with feasting. Maybe we should think more positively about the joy and the celebration of heaven if he ordained a meal, communion, to anticipate his return, a tangible, physical meal. Well, what else does this verse tell us? It says, I tell you, I will not drink fruit of the vine from now on until the day when I drink it new with you. I'm thinking about that phrase, with you. I love that. I with you, Jesus says. And that is so important. One day we will also be with Jesus physically. That was the promise for the disciples, which would have had great meaning for them because they had only known Jesus physically. And they would spend the rest of their life just following him by faith, knowing that he was alive, but he was not there physically, only spiritually with them. That has been our experience with Jesus. But one day we will be with him physically again. His work in you will be finished, and he will be with us. But the word there, you, when he says, I'll be with you, is a plural you. We will not only be reunited with Jesus, we will look around that great table of celebration, and we will be reunited with those who have graduated to heaven before us. And this is an incredible part of this communion promise. Jesus will reunite us with those we miss. He will reunite us with those we miss. Heaven is this great promise that all that Jesus started in our life here, eventually it feels a little unfinished when those graduate to heaven before us. But he will finish that work as we will be reunited with those we love in the world that he creates brand new. Finally, look at the last two words of verse 29. I tell you, I will not drink from the fruit of the vine from now on until the day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. That's a great way to put it. Jesus will celebrate us into his royal family. And that's really what's going on here, this idea of royal family. My Father reminds us of family, and kingdom reminds us of royalty. He welcomes us into his royal family. With the passing of Queen Elizabeth, there's been a lot of interest in the royal family these days, right? We wonder, what would it be like to be King Charles now? What would it be like to be Prince Andrew or 7-year-old Princess Charlotte? But did you ever think Jesus has ushered us into his royal family? He calls it my Father's kingdom. Father, family, kingdom, royalty. Jesus will celebrate us into his royal family. He will finish the work that he began of adopting us and calling us his. And he'll bring us into the fullness of all that he intended from the very beginning.